In the shadowed hills of Western Virginia, inside a weathered courthouse desk that still stands today, a single folded map waited in silence for nearly 60 years. One press of a hidden seam, and the most powerful family in the county would watch their stolen empire collapse in fire and judgment. This is the story of divine patience meeting human greed, and how one dead man's secret finally cried out for justice. Somewhere in the rugged hill country of Western Virginia, where the mountains still guard their secrets like ancient sentinels, there stands an old courthouse. Not a museum piece. Not a replica built for tourists. The original building, scarred by time, rain, and forgotten sins. Inside it sits a desk. Heavy oak, darkened by decades of oil from anxious hands, scratched by quill pens and the weight of judgments that shaped lives. Local historians who have touched it speak in hushed tones of a faint seam along the inner bottom drawer. Almost invisible. The kind of detail you only notice if something inside you already suspects the truth. For nearly 60 years, no one pressed that spot the right way. And for those 60 years, the Callaway family didn't just rule Harlan County, they were the county. They held every deed. They dictated every verdict. They drew every boundary line with invisible ink made of fear and calculation. They controlled the muddy roads that poor men like Cole walked upon. They controlled the men who counted the votes when elections came. And worst of all, it was later whispered in fearful kitchens and around dying fires, they controlled the very ground beneath the feet of families who had no idea they were standing on land that had been stolen from them long before they were born. This is the story of how it all came undone. Not by rebellion. Not by armed uprising. Not even by a bold lawyer writing in from Richmond. It collapsed because of a dead man's hidden map. Folded twice. Wrapped carefully in oilskin. Tucked inside a false bottom crafted by a cabinet maker who was paid not in coin, but in silence and the promise of future favors. One small document, that exposed 60 years of legal fraud so precise, so patient, and so coldly calculated that when the circuit court examiner finally understood the full scope of what he was seeing, the man reportedly broke down and wept like a child in the middle of the dusty records room. Before we descend deeper into the shadows of Judge Harlan Callaway and the map that would destroy his family's empire, if this kind of hidden history is new to you, you're not alone. These stories rarely make it into schoolbooks. They were never meant to. If you're ready to walk the forgotten paths where greed met its reckoning, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear right now. Hit the notification bell so these tales of justice, both earthly and divine, find you. And leave a comment below. Tell me what state, what hollow, what mountain ridge you're listening from. We want to know where these stories are still whispering in the dark. To truly feel the weight of that hidden map, you must first step back into the winter of 1831, when Harlan County, Virginia was still raw, young, and full of dangerous promise. The county had been carved out of older mountain territories less than 20 years earlier. Settlers, tough, Bible-reading men and women, had pushed deeper into the Appalachian interior, fleeing debt, seeking new beginnings, or simply answering the call of wildland that promised freedom. It was nothing like the elegant tidewater plantations to the east, with their white columns and enslaved labor humming like machinery. No. This was steep, unforgiving country. Forested ridges that disappeared into low, brooding clouds. Cold creeks that ran the color of strong tea in autumn and turned bone-pale with ice by February. The first families who filed claims here were often veterans of the war against Britain, or small farmers escaping creditors. Most registered modest parcels, 50 to 300 acres of subsistence land, thin ridgetop fields, stands of timber, and narrow creek bottoms that barely earned the name farm. But beneath their feet, unknown to almost everyone, lay something far more valuable than surface soil or timber. Coal. Not the soft, easily scratched surface coal that farmers burned in their hearths during brutal winters. No. Deep, consistent seams of bituminous black. Ran like dark veins through the mountain's bones. The kind of deposits that, by the 1840s and 1850s, would fuel furnaces, build railroads, and turn ordinary men into legends of wealth. In 1831, though, that future was still hidden in God's silence. Most residents saw only the black outcroppings along creek banks. They gathered it in buckets for their fireplaces and thought little more of it. The Industrial Revolution's hunger had not yet reached these hollows. Men still plowed with single-share plows behind weary mules. They measured their wealth in surviving winters, healthy children, and the grace of the Lord. But one man saw differently. His name was Elias Callaway. He arrived in Harlan County in 1819, not as a humble farmer seeking honest ground, but as a land agent carrying impressive letters of reference from a Richmond law firm. Whether those letters were earned through honest work or clever forgery remains a shadow even today. He was 31 years old then, lean, sharp-eyed, well-spoken in that careful, measured way of men who rehearsed their words in front of cracked mirrors at night. He wore good boots. In a county where most men stitched their own rough leather from whatever hides they could tan, good boots spoke louder than sermons. They announced, "I am not like you. I belong to a different order." Elias set up a modest office in the county seat, Garfield's Crossing, a rough settlement of perhaps 400 souls. A grist mill groaning by the river. A smoky tavern where men drowned their worries in corn whiskey. 2 small churches, one Baptist, one Methodist, where the same families prayed for rain and forgiveness on Sundays. And an unpainted wooden courthouse that leaked miserably every spring rain, as if the building itself wept for the injustices soon to be recorded inside its walls. Elias offered his services with a reassuring smile, helping settlers properly register their deeds, resolving disputed boundary lines, filing the correct paperwork with the county clerk. His rates seemed fair. His manner was patient and kind. In the early years, the surviving records show a man doing legitimate work, surveys that matched visible landmarks, measurements taken with apparent care. Several families later remembered him with something close to warmth when investigators came asking questions decades later. He explained things plain, one old widow recalled. "Brought the papers to our door instead of making us walk to town. Seemed like a Christian man." What those families could not know, what almost no one suspected, was that Elias Callaway had spent the previous 2 years walking every major ridge and hollow in the region with a very different purpose. Before he ever opened his office in Garfield's Crossing, before he presented those polished letters of reference, Elias had conducted his own private survey of the land. He hiked through laurel thickets and rhododendron hells. He noted coal outcroppings with quiet intensity. He paid local men small amounts of silver to guide him to areas rumored to have heavy black stone and swore them to silence about the true nature of his interest. By the time he hung his shingle as a helpful land agent, he already knew which parcels would be worth a king's ransom in the coming decades. He knew it not through prayerful intuition or vague geological guesses, but through cold, methodical, boot-worn observation. This was no opportunistic grift. This was a long con designed by a patient predator who could see 20, 40, even 60 years into the future, a future the hard-working, God-fearing families around him could not yet imagine. A future of railroads snaking through the mountains. Of smokestacks rising like dark towers. Of coal that would power a nation's industrial hunger. And Elias Callaway was willing to wait. By 1827, he had become the official county surveyor. By 1829, he served as the principal, though unofficial, advisor to the county court. When the elderly sitting judge, Obadiah Fenn, finally succumbed to a lung ailment in the bitter winter of 1830, the circuit appointment that followed placed Elias's older brother, Harlan Callaway, into the vacant judicial seat. Harlan was cut from different cloth than his calculating younger brother. Trained as a lawyer in Richmond, he was precise, cold, and utterly humorless. He wore his graying hair pulled back severely in a style long out of fashion in the cities, which only added to his air of stern distinction in the backcountry. He believed, with what appeared to be genuine conviction, that his family's rising dominance was simply the natural order of things, capable, educated men rising above the simpler folk, as God himself had ordained in his divine hierarchy. Together, the Callaway brothers formed a perfect, unspoken machine. Elias surveyed the land and shaped its legal description. Harlan interpreted the law and gave those descriptions the weight of judicial authority. Between them, they controlled not only what a piece of ground was, but what it was legally said to be worth. The families around them, the Combses, the Sargents, the Cornets, the Sloans, were honest, hard-working mountain people with deep roots in the soil and painfully thin margins for error. Most were illiterate or barely literate. Many had never laid eyes on the official surveys of their own land. When Elias Callaway appeared at their cabin doors in 1823 or 1824, carrying rolls of paper and speaking fluently in the intimidating language of deeds, easements, and boundary adjustments. Most did what honest men do when confronted by a confident stranger in good boots using words they didn't fully understand. They trusted him. They trusted him because he seemed helpful. Because he had helped their neighbors. Because his brother now wore the black robes of a judge, and the courthouse represented the closest thing to law and order these isolated hollows had ever known. The entire social world of Garfield's Crossing radiated outward from that leaky wooden courthouse. It was almost impossible for a man plowing 80 rocky acres, worrying about his children's empty bellies come winter, to imagine that the very source of authority itself could be corrupted. That trust would take decades to fully break. And by the time the betrayal became undeniable, Elias Callaway was already dead and buried. Judge Harlan Callaway sat deep and comfortable in the height of his power. And the county itself had been transformed around them, its wealth quietly siphoned away while its people slept. The man who would eventually pull the single thread that unraveled this entire empire was the last person anyone would have suspected. He was no fiery lawyer. No crusading journalist from the big cities. No ambitious politician. He was a quiet, 27-year-old schoolteacher named Edmund Prater. Recently arrived in Garfield's Crossing from a teaching post in Wise County, Prater stumbled into the center of this decades-long conspiracy not through ambition, but because of something far more humble, a dead woman's old cedar trunk. In the autumn of 1857, a widow named Lucinda Combs passed away at the age of 73 on the small farm she had worked alone since her husband Cornelius died 14 years earlier. She left behind no surviving children. Her nearest living relative was a nephew, Thomas Combs, who had left the county as a young man and made a modest life in Kentucky as a carpenter and journeyman builder. When word reached Thomas in October that his aunt had died and that there was some troubling dispute over the ownership of her 112-acre farm, he made the long journey back to Harlan County. He arrived in early November to a devastating discovery. The farm, 112 acres of rich creek bottom and valuable timberland, originally registered in his uncle Cornelius Combs's name back in 1818, had already been seized by the Callaway Land Company through a mysterious debt proceeding that Thomas had never heard of. A proceeding that Lucinda herself had apparently never fully understood. It had been filed and adjudicated with suspicious speed in the weeks right after her death. In most cases, that would have been the end of it. A man without money, without powerful friends, without a name that opened courthouse doors simply looked at the papers, was told the proceeding was lawful, and went home broken. Thomas Combs nearly did the same. But before leaving the county for good, he stopped at the small schoolhouse where Edmund Prater had recently taken the teaching position. Prater boarded with a distant Combs relative, and Thomas needed a warm place to sleep before his return journey to Kentucky. The two men talked late into the cold night, a fire crackling between them. One man grieving a lost inheritance. The other, a younger, still idealistic teacher, growing quietly furious on his behalf. "We'll make them pay," Prater reportedly said, though whether those were his exact words or the memory of righteous anger speaking, no one can say for certain. Prater had only been in Garfield's Crossing a few months, but he had already begun noticing troubling things at the courthouse. The way land records seemed strangely disorganized. How certain deed books had pages that appeared out of sequence or recently altered. How the current county surveyor, a man named Aldous Pickett who owed his position to Harlan Callaway's patronage, filed surveys that were strangely difficult to reconcile with older physical landmarks. Prater was no lawyer. But he had grown up helping his own father, a small county clerk in Wise County, organize legal filings. He knew what honest, well-kept records looked like. What he had seen in Harlan County's courthouse had left him with a deep, unspoken unease he could not yet name. Thomas showed him the debt proceeding papers. Combs's name back in 1818 had already been seized by the Callaway Land Company through a mysterious debt proceeding that Thomas had never heard of. A proceeding that Lucinda herself had apparently never fully understood. It had been filed and adjudicated with suspicious speed in the weeks right after her death. In most cases, that would have been the end of it. A man without money, without powerful friends, without a name that opened courthouse doors simply looked at the papers, was told the proceeding was lawful, and went home broken. Thomas Combs nearly did the same. But before leaving the county for good, he stopped at the small schoolhouse where Edmund Potter had recently taken the teaching position. Potter boarded with a distant Combs relative, and Thomas needed a warm place to sleep before his return journey to Kentucky. The two men talked late into the cold night, a fire crackling between them. One man grieving a lost inheritance. The other, a younger, still idealistic teacher, growing quietly furious on his behalf. "We'll make them pay," Potter reportedly said, though whether those were his exact words or the memory of righteous anger speaking, no one can say for certain. Potter had only been in Garfield's Crossing a few months, but he had already begun noticing troubling things at the courthouse. The way land records seemed strangely disorganized. How certain deed books had pages that appeared out of sequence or recently altered. How the current county surveyor, a man named Aldous Pickett who owed his position to Harlan Callaway's patronage, filed surveys that were strangely difficult to reconcile with older physical landmarks. Potter was no lawyer. But he had grown up helping his own father, a small county clerk in Wise County, organize legal filings. He knew what honest, well-kept records looked like. What he had seen in Harlan County's courthouse had left him with a deep, unspoken unease he could not yet name. Thomas showed him the debt proceeding papers. Potter read them slowly. Then again. He asked if Thomas still possessed any of his aunt's original documents. Thomas had one thing. An old keeping trunk. Inside that humble cedar-lined box, used by rural families for generations to safeguard what little they valued, lay the ordinary treasures of a long, hard life: a family Bible with names carefully inscribed in fading ink, a few pieces of nearly worthless old paper currency, yellowed letters tied with string, and, folded at the very bottom beneath a layer of cotton batting, a hand-drawn map. The paper had yellowed to the color of old cream. It depicted a section of creek bottom and ridgeline in terrain that was unmistakably Harlan County, though none of the official modern names were used. The boundary markers were natural features, specific trees, distinctive rock outcroppings, and a telling bend in the creek that matched descriptions in the original 1818 deed. In the corners were careful measurements, hand-calculated distances, and bearing angles, the precise notations of a surveyor working in the field. And in the lower right corner, written in a clear, steady hand, were two lines of text that would change everything. Surveyed and confirmed, October 14, 1818. Cornelius Combs, grantee. Below it, E. Callaway, county surveyor. Potter stared at those words for a long time, the firelight flickering across his face. Then he carried the map to the window and held it up to the thin, gray November light. That was when he saw it. Pressed flat against the back of the first sheet, almost translucent, attached along one fragile edge. A second sheet. Covered in additional notations. Measurements. Calculations. And along one margin, a column of numbers followed by initials. The same initials, repeated 7 times. H.C. Harlan Callaway. Potter sat down heavily on Thomas Combs's borrowed cot and did not speak for several long minutes. What that second sheet appeared to reveal, and what he would spend the next 4 cold months painstakingly confirming, was a private, parallel accounting. Official measurements recorded in the public deed books, placed beside the actual field measurements from which those public numbers had supposedly been derived. In every single case where the two sets of figures diverged, the adjustment moved in the same direction. It subtracted acreage from the honest landowner's parcel. Acreage that later, without explanation, appeared in filings belonging to the Callaway Land Company. It was not yet courtroom proof. A hand-drawn map found in a widow's trunk, with private notes in the margin, would not stand alone in a court of law. But it was something far more dangerous. It was a window into the mechanism of the machine. And once Edmund Potter had seen how the machine worked, he could never unsee it. The winter of 1857 into 1858 would prove to be one of the harshest in a generation. Creeks froze solid enough for cattle to cross on the ice. Ridge roads became impassable for weeks. Snow lay heavy on the laurel and the pines. In a strange way, it was the perfect season for what Potter was about to do. The isolation demanded the same kind of cold, methodical patience that Elias Callaway had once used to build his empire. Now that patience would be turned against the Callaways themselves. And somewhere, in the quiet of that old courthouse desk, another secret waited.
He could not write out openly. He could not ask bold questions in daylight without raising suspicion. So Edmund Prodder did what patient, righteous men have always done when facing entrenched evil: he became still.
Night after night, in the small room above the schoolhouse, he sat by the flickering light of tallow candles. The wind howled down the ridges like a warning from God himself. While the rest of Garfield's Crossing slept under heavy quilts, Prodder worked in silence. He borrowed courthouse documents during the day, always returning them before anyone could notice their absence. He studied them by candlelight until his eyes burned and his mind reeled with the weight of systematic sin. He was not entirely alone in this shadowed labor. There was one man inside the courthouse who had carried a burden for 20 long years. His name was James Arden, a slight, unassuming filing clerk in his 40s. For 2 decades, Arden had watched the land records flow through his hands like a poisoned river. He had seen the quiet alterations, the convenient omissions, the way certain names always grew richer while others slowly vanished from the tax books. Arden had said nothing all those years. Not because he was cowardly by nature, but because he was a man with a wife and 3 children who depended on his modest salary. Harlan Callaway still sat as judge in the winter of 1857, and crossing such a man could mean ruin not just for Arden, but for his entire family. In the hill country, justice was not blind. It wore the face of the man behind the bench, yet Arden was the kind of soul who could not entirely forget what he had witnessed. He kept no secret ledger, but he remembered. He remembered which filings arrived together. He remembered when entries that appeared neatly sequential in the deed books had actually been entered weeks or even months apart. He remembered the surveyors who brought documents that felt wrong even to his untrained eye, ink that seemed too fresh, measurements that contradicted the land itself. Over 20 years of standing close to power he could not challenge, Arden had mastered a very particular kind of silence. When Prodder first approached him cautiously, Arden did not refuse to speak. That would have been too dangerous, too noticeable. Instead, he spoke the way a frightened man speaks when he wants to warn without confessing. He would mention a date, almost casually. He would describe the physical appearance of a certain document. He would note a strange sequence of filings, as if commenting on the weather. And Prodder, sharp-minded and trained from boyhood by his father to see the hidden architecture of records, would listen carefully and understand exactly what was being implied. No direct accusations. No explicit statements that could be used against Arden later. It was an elaborate, careful dance, performed in the narrow space between fear and justice. 2 decades of repressed horror had made Arden fluent in the language of suggestion. And in this case, that caution may have been exactly what the situation demanded. A bolder man might have pushed too hard, sparked open confrontation, and warned the Calloways before the evidence could be secured. This kind of ancient fraud required something rarer than courage. It required patience and near invisibility. One evening in February 1858, as the road outside the courthouse lay frozen solid and the 2 men found themselves alone in the building, Arden spoke more directly than he ever had before. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I remember a cabinet maker," he said. His name was Josiah Trent. In the spring of 1836, Elias Callaway had personally hired him to do work on the courthouse furniture. Even at the time, Arden had found it strange. Courthouse property was county business. Why would Elias arrange and pay for it privately? Trent had spent 3 days working almost entirely inside Judge Harlan Callaway's private office. When he finished and left, the desk looked exactly the same to any casual eye. Whatever he had done was invisible. Arden remembered the man clearly. Quiet. Polite. Not unfriendly, but carrying the kind of deep stillness that comes from knowing something heavy and choosing not to speak it. He had eaten his noon meal in the records room, exchanging only pleasantries about the roads and the coming weather. He asked no questions about the Calloways or the court. He did his work, took his unusually generous payment, and disappeared back down the mountain. Arden had watched him leave that day with a feeling he could not name, an uneasy sense that something important had just passed him by. He had been right. It took him 21 years to finally say the name out loud. Josiah Trent had died in 1849, but his grandson, a young man named Willis Trent, still lived in the county and worked at the mill. On a bitterly cold February day when the wind cut like judgment, Arden told Prater about the cabinet maker. He spoke so quietly it was as if the walls themselves might betray them. "I saw it with my own eyes," he whispered. "I don't know if it means anything. I just remembered it." The following week, Prater made his way to the mill through deep snow to speak with Willis Trent. At first, Willis was wary. There was no reason for a schoolteacher he barely knew to be asking about his dead grandfather. And in Harlan County, the Callaway name still carried enough fear and influence to make even honest men measure their words. He gave the expected careful answers. His grandfather had been a fine craftsman who kept to himself and never caused trouble. He claimed to know little about the courthouse job. But Prater sensed the hesitation. On his second visit, he brought something with him, the precious map from Lucinda Combs's trunk. He did not explain its full meaning. He simply laid it carefully on the workbench and watched. Willis Trent stared at the old paper for a long time. Then he reached out, not quite touching it, and traced one edge with his finger through the air. Something had been troubling him since he was a boy, he finally admitted. Late in life, his grandfather had spoken of the courthouse job in the halting way old men do when describing a sin they never fully confessed. He had built something into that desk. A false bottom in the lower right drawer, operated by a clever spring-release mechanism that only someone who knew exactly where to press would ever find. A man, Willis did not say the name, but both men knew, had paid him handsomely to do this work and sworn him to absolute secrecy. The payment was far more than the craftsmanship was worth. His grandfather had understood it was not payment for skill, but the price of his silence. Before he died, Josiah Trent had told his grandson because, as he put it, a man should not take certain things to his grave without telling someone. Prater asked quietly, what did his grandfather believe the hidden compartment was for? Willis shook his head. His grandfather hadn't known for certain. He guessed it was for valuables, money, important letters, something a powerful man wanted hidden even from his own household. He had never allowed himself to consider, or had chosen not to admit, that it might contain something the law itself would desperately want to see. By the time Josiah Trent confessed on his deathbed, 13 years had already passed since he built the secret drawer. Whatever was inside the desk, if anything remained, had been waiting there in darkness for over 20 years by the time Edmund Prater arrived in Garfield's Crossing. That night, back in his small room above the schoolhouse, Prater wrote in his private notebook by candlelight. There is something inside the desk. The first question is whether it is still there after 22 years. The second question is whether I will ever be in a position to find out. Breaking into the courthouse after hours was not a step a county schoolteacher could take lightly. Prater was no reckless fool. He understood the danger clearly. He had no legal standing, no official position with the court. Only a widow's old map, a frightened clerk who dared not speak openly, and the testimony of a dead cabinetmaker. Through the rest of February and into the first hesitant thaw of March, Prater continued his careful, public work. He visited the courthouse only during regular hours. He requested only documents any citizen had the right to see: deed book indices, county plat records, public survey logs. He was building what he called the visible architecture of the case, what could be proven even if the hidden map in the desk had been discovered and removed long ago. Even without the secret compartment, the pattern was damning. Through the deed records alone, he could show that parcels bordering Callaway holdings repeatedly suffered small reductions in acreage at the moment of transfer. 2 acres here, 5 there. Adjustments so minor they looked like innocent rounding errors until you mapped them across 40 years. Then the pattern became unmistakable. The errors always ran in one direction. Always against the small landowner. Always in favor of the Callaway name appearing later in the chain. It was not yet courtroom proof. A skilled defense lawyer would call it coincidence. But Prater had come to believe that patterns were the one thing liars found hardest to completely erase. A meticulous deceiver might hide individual acts of fraud, but few were wise enough to step back and see what the collection of those acts revealed when viewed together. Yet Prater discovered something even darker than he expected. The original scheme had clearly belonged to Elias Callaway, his private surveys, his secret adjustments, his hidden accounting.
But Elias had died in 1851. And the pattern in the deed books had not stopped with his death. It had continued, evolving into something new and perhaps even more insidious. The adjustments became less frequent but larger. Manufactured debt proceedings, debts that landowners swore they never incurred, became the primary weapon.
Cases moved through Harlan Callaway's court with unnatural speed.
Witnesses mysteriously failed to appear. Documents appeared and then vanished from the record. The survey fraud had been Elias's method. The judicial fraud was Harlan's continuation, perfected and expanded once his brother was no longer alive to manipulate the physical surveys himself. This was what kept Prater awake at night with a coldness that went beyond intellectual discovery. Elias had built the machine. Harlan had not merely inherited it, he had embraced it as his own, running it for nearly a decade with the cold authority of the bench. The two brothers had apparently never needed to speak of it openly. The knowledge had passed between them the way certain family sins are inherited, through silent observation, through quiet participation, through the gradual understanding that you are now the rightful heir to something that has no honest name. Arden confirmed this carefully in one of their whispered conversations. After Elias died, the complaints from landowners changed in texture. Earlier grievances had been about strange surveys and moving boundary lines. Later ones were about the court itself, proceedings that resolved before any real defense could be mounted, judgments issued with terrifying efficiency. If you're listening and already beginning to see how deep this corruption ran, drop your theory in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a like. Your engagement keeps stories like this one alive, stories the powerful never wanted told. Harlan Callaway had been using the judge's bench not with clumsy greed, but with the masterful precision of a man who had presided over that court for 25 years. Through timing, through procedural rulings, through his absolute power to decide which arguments mattered and which did not, which witnesses were credible, which debts were legitimate. In a remote county where few had the money or courage to appeal to a higher court, a judge like Harlan Callaway held near godlike power over land and fortune. And he had exercised it with the same cold patience his brother had once shown with his surveying chain and compass. The break, when it finally came, arrived not through brilliant planning, but through simple coincidence finally bending toward justice. In March of 1858, Harlan Callaway, now 69 years old, heavier, and suffering from a painful kidney ailment his doctor could not properly treat, was required to travel to Richmond for an important circuit court matter that could not be delayed. He would be gone for at least 10 days. His son Randolph, who had taken over much of the family's active land operations, traveled with him. The courthouse would not be empty. The county clerk, Ferris Don, a man loyal to the Callaways, would keep his regular hours. But the judge's private office would remain locked, as it always was when Harlan was away. James Arden had a key not to the judge's office itself, that key stayed with Harlan or locked in Don's desk, but to the main building and the records room that sat adjacent to the judge's chambers. The interior door between the records room and the judge's private office was older than the exterior lock. Arden had noticed over 20 years that its catch did not fully seat when the temperature dropped low enough. And March was still bitterly cold. Arden never explicitly agreed to help Prater enter the chambers. The two men had never spoken the words aloud. That kind of directness was too dangerous. But on the evening of March 11, 1858, when James Arden left the courthouse at his usual hour, he simply did not lock the records room door behind him. James Arden walked home that night without saying a word to anyone. Later, his wife would recall that he sat up far later than usual, staring into the fire, breathing in short, uneasy breaths as if the weight of 20 years of silence had suddenly become too heavy for his chest. Meanwhile, at 11 o'clock, Edmund Prater moved like a ghost through the darkened streets of Garfield's Crossing. He carried only a small lantern with the shutter drawn almost completely closed, allowing just enough light to keep him from stumbling over frozen ruts or low-hanging branches. His heart pounded against his ribs with every step. The schoolteacher knew that if he was caught tonight, there would be no explanation that could save him. The records room door was unlocked exactly as Arden had left it. The interior door leading into Judge Harlan Callaway's private chambers required nothing more than the gentle upward pressure Arden had once described in passing. Not advice. Just an observation.
A small mercy offered in the language of fear. Prodder stepped inside. The office was bitterly cold and carried the heavy scent of old pipe tobacco mixed with the dry, musty smell of decades of legal papers. The desk dominated the room, a massive walnut piece, expensive even when new, now imposing with the gravity of power and age. It seemed to watch him. He placed his lantern on the floor so its light would not spill through the windows. With steady but trembling hands, he opened the lower right drawer. It was filled with ordinary correspondence and documents, the everyday accumulation of a judge's life. Prodder removed each stack carefully, laying them in precise order on the cold floor so he could replace them exactly as he found them. His fingers moved along the smooth wooden bottom of the drawer, pressing gently from left to right along the seam. Near the far right corner, the wood gave slightly, not breaking, but yielding with the controlled softness of a well-crafted mechanism. He pressed again, firmer this time. A soft, almost inaudible click. The false bottom lifted along a concealed hinge. Beneath it, in a shallow space no more than 2 inches deep, lay a document wrapped carefully in oilskin. Prodder's breath caught. He removed the package, closed the false bottom, replaced every paper exactly as it had been, and quietly left the chambers. He pulled the interior door shut without latching it, slipped out of the courthouse, and walked straight back to his room above the schoolhouse. Only when he was safely inside with the lantern turned fully up did he unfold what he had taken. It was a map far larger than the one from Lucinda Combs's trunk, nearly the full width of the judge's desk when spread out. And infinitely more damning. This was no simple survey. It showed the entire county as it had existed in the late 1810s and 1820s. Every registered land parcel was carefully drawn with its officially recorded acreage. But overlaid in a different ink, precise, meticulous lines, were the corrected measurements. The real boundaries. The true acreage. The actual ground each family believed they owned. The divergences were not random. They were systematic. In every single case where the corrected measurements appeared, the official record had been reduced. And that missing acreage had been quietly absorbed into adjacent parcels that, over time, always ended up under Callaway control. The map spanned more than 40 years of transfers. It was not the work of a guilty man hiding evidence out of shame. It was a master reference. A working tool. Elias Callaway had kept it not to confess his sins, but to ensure the massive fraud remained internally consistent. A single large lie requires more discipline, more precision, and more careful record-keeping than honest work ever does. At the bottom of the map, in the same careful hand that had signed the Combs document years earlier, was a date, March 1836. The exact month and year Josiah Trent, the cabinetmaker, had installed the false bottom in the desk. Elias Callaway had hidden his own master map inside his brother's desk 22 years before Prodder found it. He had died in 1851 without ever retrieving it. What Prodder did next revealed the true measure of the man. He did not run to the county clerk in panic. He did not confront the Callaways when they returned from Richmond. He did not rush to tell the town or publish wild accusations. Instead, he became even more careful. Over 4 cold nights in March, working by lantern light until his fingers cramped, Prodder made 2 complete hand-drawn copies of the master map. He cross-referenced every detail against the original Combs survey and the deed books he had studied for months. He then wrote a formal 23-page account in his precise schoolteacher's handwriting, meticulously explaining the methodology of the fraud and identifying, as clearly as possible, the affected parcels and the families who had lost their land. Finally, he wrote a detailed letter to a lawyer in Abingdon, Washington County, Jervis Sutton, a man with a quiet regional reputation for taking on difficult land fraud cases that most county attorneys refused because the opponents were too powerful and the plaintiffs too poor. Sutton replied 2 weeks later. His tone was cautious but clearly intrigued. He wrote that if Prodder's documentation was as he described, this was the most systematically organized case of survey fraud he had encountered in 30 years of practice. This was the moment the danger truly began. Prodder had naively believed that the greatest risk lay in finding the map. That once the truth was in his hands, justice would carry its own unstoppable momentum. He was wrong. A truth locked silently in a desk is harmless. A truth that begins moving through lawyers, circuit court examiners, and official filings becomes a living threat. And threats provoke responses. Prater never learned exactly how Randolph Callaway discovered that something was stirring. He suspected the county clerk, Ferris Don, who noticed everything. He wondered whether Arden, under pressure, had let something slip. The exact channel remained a mystery. What he did understand was that the Callaways did not simply run a family business. They presided over an entire ecology of power in Harlan County. Merchants, mill operators, innkeepers, and tradesmen, more than 20 prominent men, depended on Callaway patronage in one form or another. County contracts, favorable loans, preferential treatment in small disputes before the court. These men were not necessarily conspirators. Most had no idea of the full depth of the fraud. But they were highly attuned to any sign that the Callaway family's power might be threatened. And an outsider schoolteacher who was suddenly spending long hours at the courthouse, requesting old deed books, meeting secretly with a carpenter from Kentucky and a visibly nervous filing clerk, that was exactly the kind of thing observant men noticed and quietly mentioned to other observant men. In early May of 1858, 2 warnings arrived within the same week. First, Prater's room above the schoolhouse was searched. He knew immediately because he had left small telltale signs, a thread stretched across a drawer, a book placed at a precise angle. The search had been professional and thorough. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. They had not found the copies of the master map, which Prater had hidden in the schoolhouse cellar behind a loose stone. They had not found his 23-page written account. But they had found his personal notebooks. And they had read them, then carefully put them back exactly as they were. It was an act that carried both confidence and threat. The notebooks contained observations, questions, calculations, and cross-references, but no explicit conclusions that could be used as direct evidence. Still, anyone who read them would understand that Prater was building something dangerous. Second, Thomas Combs was approached on the lonely road between Garfield's Crossing and his boarding house by 2 men he did not recognize. They delivered their message politely, almost gently. They told him that his aunt's debt had been a legitimate proceeding. That the farm was now lawfully Callaway property. That continuing to pursue the matter would be bad for everyone involved, especially for people from out of county who didn't understand how local arrangements worked. Thomas was a large, strong man and not easily intimidated. But he was alone on a mountain road in a county where the judge and the county surveyor shared the same powerful name. He understood the warning perfectly. The men had been entirely polite. That, he later said, was the most chilling part. Politeness from such men meant they were certain they would not need to be anything else. That same evening, Thomas came to Prater. They met in the cold, empty schoolhouse rather than Prater's room. For 2 hours they spoke in hushed voices. For the first time, Prater told Thomas the full scope of what he had discovered, the master map, the copies he had made, the letter to Sutton, and how the fraud had operated like a machine across 4 decades. Then Prater revealed something he had told no one else. While studying the master map the previous week, he had noticed 4 parcels along the sparsely settled eastern boundary of the county marked with a small, unique symbol he had not seen anywhere else, a double crosshatch. He had spent several nights trying to match those parcels to the official deed books. All 4 were currently listed as unregistered public land. But in the early records, before a particular series of filings in 1831, they had been registered to 4 different families, all bearing the same surname, Harp. Prater had found no trace of any Harp family currently living in the county. No descendants. No records of sale or transfer. Roughly 300 acres that had existed as private property in 1830 had simply vanished from private ownership by 1832, absorbed into county unregistered land through a process Prater could not trace. Because the relevant pages in the deed book from that period were missing. Not damaged. Not faded. Missing. The binding holes showed clearly where entire pages had been carefully cut free. Thomas asked the question that hung heavy in the cold air. What happened to the Harp family? Prater shook his head slowly. I don't know. No record of them leaving the county. No record of any legal proceeding against them. They had simply ceased to appear in any county document after the spring of 1831. The schoolhouse fell deathly quiet. Outside, the May evening was turning cold the way mountain evenings do, even in late spring.
Thomas finally spoke. "Then we need to get out of this county before we send anything." He was right.
They left Garfield's Crossing on a Monday morning in mid-May, departing 3 hours apart and claiming ordinary errands in neighboring towns. Prodder carried the 2 copies of the master map and his detailed written account carefully sewn inside the lining of his coat. Thomas Combs carried the original map that Prodder had taken from the judge's desk, a decision Prodder had made quietly, without ever fully deciding. The same way men sometimes make the most consequential choices of their lives. What ultimately happened to those 4 Harp family parcels, and to the Harp families themselves, was never fully resolved in the legal proceedings that followed.
Jervis Sutton included the matter in his filing as an area of serious concern.
The circuit court examiner later noted in his report that the missing deed book pages and the sudden disappearance of the 4 parcels fit the broader pattern of fraud. However, the complete absence of surviving documentation made any specific finding impossible.
He recommended further investigation. No further investigation was ever formally conducted.
Whether the Harps had been quietly bought out, frightened away, or suffered something far darker, the official record does not say. The record simply stops at the edge of a terrible question that, in the end, no one pressed hard enough to answer.
And that silence, too, is a kind of verdict.
Jervis Sutton met Prodder and Thomas Combs on the evening of May 19, 1858, in the back room of a modest tavern in Abington, a place Sutton dryly remarked he had conducted more honest legal business than in any courthouse he had ever entered. He spread Prodder's materials across the table and examined them for nearly 2 hours, asking sharp, technical questions that Prodder answered as precisely as he could. Sutton was a small, thin-haired man who constantly removed and replaced his reading spectacles. He had the cautious manner of someone who had been disappointed by evidence too many times before and had learned to verify everything twice. At the end of the long examination, he looked up and said, "The map from the desk is the key. Without the original, this remains a strong circumstantial case, but still contestable. With it, and with the cabinetmaker's grandson willing to testify about the false bottom, that changes everything." Prodder reminded him quietly, "The cabinetmaker himself is dead. But his grandson, he'll say what he told me. Whether he'll say it under oath in open court, that I cannot promise." Sutton was quiet for a moment, then tapped the master map. "The handwriting on this map matches the surveyor's signature on the Combs deed. I can have that comparison done in Richmond by a credible expert. If confirmed, it establishes that this document belonged to Elias Callaway and was deliberately hidden in his brother Harlan's desk. That is not accident. That is conspiracy." He looked directly at Thomas Combs. Sutton looked across the tavern table at Thomas Combs, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "The original deed for your family's land was properly registered in 1818. The debt proceeding against your aunt's estate was filed only after she died. The real question is whether the debt was ever real, or whether it was manufactured from nothing." Thomas shifted in his chair. "There were letters among her papers," he said quietly. "Some from a man I didn't recognize. They referenced an account that Lucinda told me, in the last years of her life, she knew nothing about." Sutton leaned back, a grim satisfaction crossing his face. "There it is." He then turned to the section of Prodder's written account describing the 4 Harp parcels, the properties that had mysteriously vanished from the deed books in 1831. Entire families that left no forward trace. No sales. No deaths recorded. No descendants. Sutton read that section twice, slowly. He asked Prodder to confirm that the relevant pages in the deed book weren't merely faded or illegible, they had been physically cut out. Prodder confirmed it. Sutton set that portion of the account aside, separate from the rest of the materials. His voice grew heavier. "The evidence on the main fraud is conclusive. But the Harp matter, it is either nothing, a family that sold quietly and the paperwork was simply lost, or it is something considerably darker. Time is short. If we press it too hard in the filing, the court may treat it as speculation and allow the defense to use it to poison the credibility of everything else. If we leave it out entirely, we allow something potentially very serious to remain buried. He thought about it for 3 long days. In the end, Jervis Sutton included the harp disappearances not as a central accusation, but as a documented anomaly that demanded further investigation, a quiet question embedded in the legal filing rather than a direct charge. Prater later wrote that it was the most careful and morally aware piece of legal judgment he had ever witnessed, a man deliberately naming the shape of something he could not fully see, knowing the cost of both speaking and staying silent. The formal filing reached the Circuit Court in Richmond in July of 1858. Sutton had been meticulous in his choice of venue. He refused to trust any jurisdiction where the Callaway name still carried influence. That caution proved wise. When word of the filing reached Garfield's Crossing, the response from Randolph Callaway was swift and brutal. He retained 2 experienced lawyers from Lynchburg and filed a fierce counter-petition. They argued that the map was an obvious forgery, that Prater had fabricated or altered the document to support a fraudulent claim, and that the entire proceeding was nothing more than outsiders attempting to unsettle lawful property rights established over 40 years. The language was careful, confident, and coldly effective. It painted Edmund Prater specifically as the villain, a ruthless young man with no stake in the county's welfare, motivated by unclear personal grievances. It was a strategy the powerful had used many times before. When accused of fraud, accuse your accuser first, and do it in formal legal language so the accusation itself feels like the real proceeding. But Sutton had anticipated this move. During the 2 months between filing and the first Richmond hearing, he quietly gathered additional evidence that even Prater had not uncovered. He found records of a second surveyor who had been active in Harlem County in the early 1840s. In 1843, this man had filed a formal complaint with the county court about serious discrepancies in the official deed books. The complaint had been received, properly docketed, and then somehow never acted upon. The docketing entry still existed in the Richmond Circuit records. The original complaint document had vanished, but the entry proved it had once existed, meaning someone with influence had deliberately caused it to disappear after it was officially received. Sutton also located the second surveyor himself, now an elderly man living quietly in Tennessee. He had left Harlem County abruptly in the autumn of 1843 under circumstances he had never publicly explained. At first, the old man refused to get involved. He said he had put it behind him. He was old. It was a long time ago. Sutton traveled personally to Tennessee in June 1858 and spent 2 full days with him. Whatever was said in those private conversations was never recorded. But when Sutton left, the elderly surveyor agreed to provide a sworn, notarized affidavit describing exactly what he had discovered in the deed books in 1843, what he had filed, and what happened to him in the weeks afterward. That included a visit from 2 men who arrived unannounced at his rented room in Garfield's Crossing. They told him, very quietly, that it would be better for his family if he found work in another county. He had taken their advice. His affidavit was entered into evidence. The circuit examiner assigned to the case was George Pemberton, a 52-year-old man known for his thorough, unsentimental, and meticulous work. He took possession of the master map, the comparative surveys, Sutton's handwriting analysis, the docketing entry of the vanished complaint, the old surveyor's affidavit, and all the Combs deed materials. For 6 long weeks, Pemberton examined everything in a locked room in the Richmond courthouse. His final report, filed in September 1858, was 41 pages long. It confirmed the handwriting match between the master map and Elias Callaway's known signatures. It confirmed the systematic divergence between the official survey records and the corrected measurements on the hidden map. It established that the 1843 complaint had been received and docketed by a court clerk whose appointment had been arranged through the Callaway's Richmond connections, a clerk who left his position in 1844 and could never be located afterward. Pemberton also found that the debt proceeding filed against Lucinda Combs's estate referenced an account that had no documentary basis in any bank or institution in the region. In the measured, restrained language of legal examination, Pemberton concluded that the evidence supported a finding of systematic survey fraud extending from approximately 1820 to at least 1851. This included the deliberate manipulation of official land records, the corruption of court filing processes, and the unlawful enrichment of the Callaway family through the absorption of land belonging to at least 31 identified parcels. Regarding the Harp families, Pemberton wrote only a single, careful paragraph. He noted that the missing deed book pages, the complete absence of any record of the four families after 1831, and the pattern of surrounding entries were consistent with the broader fraud and warranted independent formal investigation. He recommended that the Virginia Attorney General's office take up the question separately from the current proceeding.
Whether that recommendation was ever acted upon remains unclear in the surviving records.
When Pemberton's 41-page report was read aloud in open court in Richmond in October 1858, Harlan Callaway was present.
He was 70 years old by then. Still straight-backed.
Still wearing his gray hair in the outdated, severe style that once made him look distinguished in the backcountry. He sat beside his lawyers and did not change expression as the examiner's devastating findings were entered into the record. He did not speak. He had not spoken publicly about the case at any point. His lawyers had spoken extensively, skillfully, and ultimately without success. His son Randolph, seated beside him, was far less controlled. Witnesses later described him turning pale, then flushed, then pale again as the pages progressed. At one point he leaned toward one of the lawyers and whispered urgently.
The lawyer immediately shook his head, preventing whatever outburst Randolph had intended.
After the reading concluded, Harlan Callaway rose slowly. He stated that he wished to reserve the right to respond fully at the appropriate proceeding, then walked out of the courthouse with a steadiness that many observers found more unsettling than any emotional display could have been. He died 4 months later, in February 1859, from the kidney ailment that had tormented him for years. He passed in his house in Garfield's Crossing, in the same county he had quietly ruled for nearly 3 decades, never having been formally convicted of any crime. Whether he died knowing what was coming for his family and chose to depart before the final collapse, or whether he simply died because sick old men eventually die, no one could say with certainty. The legal proceedings that followed Harlan Callaway's death dragged on for 4 long years, an eternity for a family watching its empire crumble, yet a reasonable pace for untangling 60 years of carefully woven deception. Randolph Callaway fought every step, as men in his position almost always do. The alternative was to stop fighting and accept the full weight of what had been stolen. In the end, the Virginia courts ordered the reversion of 23 of the 31 identified parcels back to the original registered families or their documented heirs. 8 parcels could not be fully restored because the chains of subsequent sales had grown too complex, threatening to create new injustices. For those, the court ordered monetary compensation paid from the Callaway estate, compensation that significantly reduced what remained of the family's holdings. The Callaway Land Company was formally dissolved by court order in 1862. The family did not vanish overnight. Randolph eventually settled what debts he could, sold most of the remaining land to outside investors, and lived out the rest of his life in considerably reduced circumstances in a modest house in Abingdon. His children moved away by the 1880s, and the once feared Callaway name gradually came to mean very little to the new generations growing up in Harlan County. Edmund Prater never returned to Garfield's Crossing after slipping out in May 1858. He stayed in Abingdon, first working as a clerk for Jervis Sutton, then studying law under his guidance. He was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1864 and practiced in Washington County for the rest of his working life, specializing, as Sutton had before him, in complex land title disputes. James Arden, the longtime courthouse filing clerk, remained in his position throughout the entire ordeal. He was questioned extensively but confirmed only what he knew and nothing beyond it. After the Callaway proceedings ended, he continued working as the county's filing clerk until his retirement in 1871. He never made a single public statement about the case. Yet historians later noted that the records he maintained for the remainder of his career were the most precise and impeccably kept in the county's history. Thomas Combs's family farm was among the 23 parcels restored. He returned to the land in 1863 and worked it until coal interests began buying heavily in the region in the late 1870s. When he finally sold, he did so with full knowledge of what the land was truly worth. He had not been cheated of that knowledge a second time. Willis Trent, the mill worker and grandson of the cabinet maker, did testify in the Richmond proceeding. He repeated clearly and without embellishment what his grandfather had told him on his deathbed. Randolph Callaway's lawyers cross-examined him for most of an afternoon, trying every tactic to break the account of a dead man told through a living one.
Willis held firm. He was not a complicated witness. He simply repeated what he knew to be true. And the honest repetition of truth is not easily shattered even by skilled lawyers. The desk itself remained in the courthouse.
In November 1858, the false bottom was demonstrated to the court examiner during an in-person inspection, with Sutton, Proberton, and representatives from both sides present. The spring mechanism functioned exactly as Willis Trent had described. Proberton noted in his report that the woodwork was of exceptional quality, precise joinery, beautifully concealed. In different circumstances, it would have been a credit to the craftsman who built it. Josiah Trent had clearly been a skilled man. He had simply been paid to hide something that should never have existed.
In the end, the entire chain was hauntingly simple.
A fraud that consumed 40 years of a county's life was brought down by a widow's cedar trunk, a cold February window, a frightened clerk's quiet words, and an old man who could not carry his secret to the grave without first telling someone. And one schoolteacher brave enough to press the hidden corner of a drawer in the dark.
Soft pause. Music shifts to a more reflective, almost spiritual tone. There is one final question that people who encounter this story often find themselves returning to late at night. Not about the law. Not about how much land was recovered or how much was lost forever. But about Elias Callaway himself, the man who built the entire mechanism in the first place. In 1836, at the height of his power, he had the master map created and deliberately hidden inside his brother's desk. He could have destroyed it. From a purely self-protective standpoint, there was no reason to preserve a complete record of his own crimes. The map was only useful as a working tool, to keep the false numbers consistent so the lies would not eventually contradict one another. Once the major surveying work was done, that function should have ended. And yet, he kept it. He had it hidden by a skilled craftsman. It was as if the documentation itself had become something he could not let go of, a private monument to what he had built, even though what he had built was theft on a massive scale. Some historians have suggested he kept the map because he feared his own brother. Without a record showing Harlan's involvement, the HC notations in the margins, the judge who had given the fraud its legal cover, Elias, would have stood as the sole responsible party if the scheme was ever exposed. In that reading, the map was not merely a personal document. It was mutual insurance. If this comes apart, it comes apart for both of us. If that was the calculation, the map survived both brothers by 7 years, lying silently in darkness until a schoolteacher pressed a hidden spring mechanism by the light of a mostly shuttered lantern. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe everything was truly revealed in those proceedings? Or does a fraud maintained with this level of patience and discipline for 40 years necessarily leave corners that were never fully exposed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this kind of forgotten history, real stories of greed, justice, and the long shadow of sin moves you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when the past whispers again. The history that gets buried doesn't disappear. It waits. And sometimes, it still demands its reckoning.